All right, so this week we're diving into a story that, well, it feels like it's straight from the headlines, but there's more to it than we might think at first glance.
Yeah, definitely.
We're talking about Yahya Sinwar,
right,
the leader of Hamas in Gaza, who was reportedly killed this week.
And you know what's really interesting here is that even people who, would consider him an enemy respected him as a warrior. Sinwar's life is, from refugee to resistance leader, and it's really deeply intertwined with the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I mean, how often does someone go from being imprisoned for decades to leading a major political and military force?
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's really rare,
Yeah.
and it's precisely why we need to unpack this whole thing.
Yeah.
Sinwar wasn't born into power, not in the traditional sense at least.
Right.
He was born in a refugee camp, Khan Yunis, back in 1962, and this is after his family fled during the 1948 Palestinian exodus.
Okay.
And that experience of displacement, it's really key to understanding Sinwar's worldview.
So we're talking about someone who, from a very young age, understood what it meant to be, on one side of this conflict.
Absolutely. And his early run-ins with Israeli authorities, that just solidified his perspective even further. At just 20 years old, he was arrested for what they called Islamic activities.
Wow.
So think about that. A young man barely out of his teens and already considered a threat.
And it didn't stop there.
No.
Multiple arrests, years in prison. It's like his story was already being written even back then.
It's true. And one arrest in particular really stands out. 1985. That's when he met Sheikh Ahmed Yassim, founder of Hamas.
While in prison.
While they were both in prison together.
Wow.
And that encounter really seems to be when Sinwar's path really crystallized.
And then came the prison years. 22 years.
Yeah.
Over 2 decades behind bars. It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of time.
It really is. And, those 22 years are absolutely crucial to understanding the strategist that Sinwar would eventually become.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just time served. It was like a masterclass in the tactics and the thinking of his adversary.
Right.
So for one, he helped to establish Hamas's internal security organization from within prison.
Wow. So he's essentially building the infrastructure of resistance while he's incarcerated.
Exactly.
That's some next-level strategic thinking.
It really is, and it gets even more intriguing.
Okay.
He becomes fluent in Hebrew during this time,
Wow.
mastering the language of his captors. He understood that to know your enemy, to be able to anticipate their moves, that's powerful. And this wasn't about survival. This was about developing the skills and the knowledge that he would need to lead.
Wow. And he put those skills to use when he got out.
Oh, absolutely.
Wasn't he part of that prisoner exchange?
Huge prisoner exchange.
Back in 2011.
Yeah, the Gilad Shalit exchange.
Right.
Over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released for one Israeli soldier.
Wow.
And even amidst all of that, Sinwar stood out.
Which is crazy because you think after 22 years, you might just want to lay low.
Right.
But
It's not Sinwar.
not Sinwar at all. He jumps right back into Hamas leadership.
Oh, yeah. He became the leader of Hamas in Gaza by 2017.
Wow.
From prisoner to the top of the organization. It just shows the kind of respect he had.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Early on, we actually see signs that he would have preferred diplomacy to conflict.
Really?
Yeah.
That doesn't really track with the image we see.
I know. It's surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
But in 2018, he makes this public statement
Okay.
that another war with Israel was definitely not in our interest. And this wasn't just empty words.
Right.
He knew the cost of conflict, not just for the Palestinian people, but for the future of Palestine.
So what changed? Because it feels like things really escalated from there.
Well, you have to look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
The political landscape was changing drastically at the time.
Okay.
You had the rise of Israel's most right-wing government ever.
Right.
Tensions were erupting at the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Right.
And there was this looming possibility of Israeli-Saudi normalization.
Okay.
So from Sinwar's perspective,
Yeah.
these weren't just isolated events.
Right.
These were existential threats.
So it's almost like he felt backed into a corner
Exactly.
and had to take a more aggressive stance.
It's like the old saying, the best defense is a good offense.
Right.
And that leads us to the event that changed everything, the October 7th attack.
Which Israeli officials were pretty quick to call Sinwar the mastermind behind.
Right. Was he really, though?
Right.
It's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely possible he played a role,
Right.
but to try to figure out the exact chain of command within Hamas,
Right.
incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
We know Mohammed Daif, the head of their military wing, is still a major player if he's still alive,
Right.
if those reports are true.
And to make things even more complicated, there was that whole thing with Sinwar's family.
Oh, yeah.
Al Jazeera reported that the Israeli military released images of them in a tunnel complex, claiming they had been interrogated.
Talk about psychological warfare.
Wow.
It's a chilling tactic.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's true or not, it just highlights how brutal this conflict really is.
And it wasn't just Israel watching Sinwar, right?
Right.
Didn't he also have a target on his back from the International Criminal Court?
He did. The ICC had actually issued a warrant for his arrest.
Wow.
Along with some other Hamas leaders on charges of war crimes.
Wow. So this wasn't just a regional conflict anymore.
Not at all.
This was global.
Global stage. And with Sinwar as the figurehead,
Right.
it put him in a really tough spot.
It's just incredible to me how a story that starts in a refugee camp ends up, in the crosshairs of international courts and global politics.
Yeah, it really speaks to how complex this conflict is.
Yeah.
And how figures like Sinwar really had to learn to navigate this web of power.
Right.
But now with his reported death, the question becomes, what kind of lasting impact did he actually have?
Right, because it's not always as simple as, okay, the leader is gone, problem solved.
Right.
Sometimes it's like you're creating a void that's even harder to deal with.
Absolutely.
What are the experts saying about potential successors?
Well, nobody can say for sure right now, but most likely it'll be somebody who's already in a position of power within Hamas.
Okay.
Names like Ismail Haniyeh have been thrown around.
Right.
He's the current head of their political bureau.
Right.
But whether he can really command the same respect and have that same authority as Sinwar,
Right.
that's the big question.
And that's what makes this all so fascinating to me. Sinwar was such a unique figure, right?
Totally.
He was a pragmatist who understood diplomacy, but he also, wasn't afraid to use force when he felt he had to.
Exactly.
So what happens to that balance now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, will we see a doubling down on those more aggressive tactics that really defined his later years? Or could this be a chance for a different approach? Maybe even a new chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It's almost like Sinwar's life and now his reported death. It all forces us to really confront just how complicated this conflict really is.
Absolutely.
And how seemingly impossible it can feel to find a solution.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if there is even a path towards peace, or are we just stuck in these cycles of violence forever?
It's a question that people have been wrestling with for decades.
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer. But I do think it's important to remember that Yahya Sinwar, for all the violence associated with his name, he was still a product of this conflict himself.
And that understanding, that recognition that even the people that we view as, the enemy are shaped by forces that are out of their control.
Totally.
Maybe that's the first step towards something different.
Maybe.
It's not easy, but it might be necessary.
I think so.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to break all of this down with us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.